Boldwood presents The Cuckoo Sister, written by Alison Stockham and read by Imogen Church. The moral right of the author has been asserted. This performance is owned by Boldwood. For my parents, Lynn and Fred, who never tried to talk me out of my dreams. Chapter 1. The darkness of the evening deepened, draping itself over Maggie as she sat immobile outside the hospital. It was busy as people rushed in, rushed out, rushed home. Time slowed. Maggie felt like she was in one of those photographs where the headlights from passing cars blur into lines, the light still there long after the movement has gone. She felt sharply in focus, with the world around her blurring into a messy tangle. How did I get here? What happened? It didn't seem so long ago that she was doing a job that she loved, enjoying her freedom, with no ties and with every possibility still at her feet. Now, her days blurred into a non-stop carousel of chores, only ever interrupted by the seemingly endless stream of arguments between her and Stephen. It was the only focus on which she could hang her days. An image of Stephen came to her mind. Him trying to get out the door and being delayed when he sat down to put on his shoes, only to find the empty banana skin that Maggie had not been able to locate earlier after Emily had eaten its contents. "Where is it, Poppet? It needs to go in the compost bin so the worms can have their tea too," Maggie had tried to encourage her. Emily loved worms and was always digging them up to show her mother, like a proud, tiny David Attenborough. It was to no avail, and the offending item had gone undetected, until Stephen sat on it in his immaculate work suit. "What the... For goodness sake! Maggie! I'm going to have to change. I'm going to be late. I didn't need this today of all days." He softened his voice a little as he turned to his daughter. "Emily, the sofa is not a bin." Emily had burst into tears at the still sharp tone of her father's voice. Her baby brother Elliot also started crying, scared by the sudden shouting. Maggie, exhausted and holding 2 sobbing children, had succumbed to tears as well. Stephen had apologised, but the atmosphere had taken days to recover. The sharp feeling of failure had sat with Maggie as she tried to do better, tried to keep everyone happy, tried to be good enough. Maggie snapped her head up, aware suddenly of what she was meant to be doing. She should go back. How long had she sat in the dark, muddle-headed on this bench? She didn't know. Only by using the cold that had moved into her fingers, her toes, and had reached her core as a marker, did she guess that she had been sitting there far longer than she would have imagined. She got up, tried to encourage the bite in the air on her face to wake her up, get her to focus, but she couldn't do it. The events of the day were playing over and over in her mind. It had been an awful day, full of tantrums and tears. Everyone was tired. Everyone needed it to be bedtime. Trying to make a decent dinner and being distracted by the children, Maggie had brought 2 bouncy balls into the kitchen, a way of keeping the children close and entertained while she got their tea ready. Now, with hindsight, crystal clear in the blackness of the evening, Maggie scoffed at herself remembering feeling a rare success. She'd solved the need to be in two places at once dilemma. Clever her. If she had been able to look at this scene from the outside, then maybe she would have seen it coming. She might have been able to visualize just what might go wrong. But in the middle of it all, it didn't even cross her mind. This is what would haunt her all her days from this one forward. She hadn't even considered it. Maggie walked with no real direction, just wanting to move to know that she could. Her feet felt heavy, her legs as though she was wading through thick mud. Her body pushing her onwards, her mind pulling her back. She felt utterly conflicted. What to do? Where to go? Images were coming at her thick and fast now that she was alone, with no distraction for her brain. It was busy outside A&E. The hustle and bustle of people coming and going, ambulances arriving, a revolving door of life-changing moments going on around her. She had to get away, to get some peace, so that she could think straight. She walked into the darkness of the hospital site towards the office buildings in front of her and away along the road. Now she was alone, her shadow from the streetlight her only companion. She leant on its lamppost for balance as she saw herself picking up the pan of pasta and taking it to the sink. One of the balls that the children had been playing with had been abandoned, and it sat unnoticed until the exact moment Maggie stood on it. It rolled away, she lost her footing, and in trying to right herself, she dropped the pan. Everything slowed down, but only enough for Maggie to be able to see the horrific thing that was going to happen. Not enough time to do anything to stop it. The starchy, sweet smell of the pasta came back to her, and Maggie turned and vomited onto the grass. She was shaking. Screams ricocheted in her head. Emily and Elliot howling in pained terror as the scalding water landed on them. "Mummy! Mummy!" The water splashed over Emily like a slap in the face, landed on Elliot's back like shards of glass cutting into his baby-soft skin. Maggie spat out the bile from her mouth, its sourness clinging to her taste buds like poison. She gulped down the cold air and stood up. She was resolute. She knew that she had to keep on walking. She couldn't go back. She had done the one thing she feared most. She had hurt her children. She was disgusting. She was neglectful. And the best thing she could do for anyone was to keep on walking. Just get away. She put one foot in front of the other until she had no idea where she was. Suddenly, her pocket buzzed, making her jump. Maggie reached in and took out her phone. She held it up, her screen photo of all of them together and smiling. Happy families. They say the camera never lies. Everything lies. Trying hard to concentrate on the letters in front of her, Maggie looked at the screen again. Rose. Her sister was calling her, most likely wondering where she had got to. She'd just popped out for a breath of fresh air. The yellow strip lighting and low ceilings of the hospital had been making her eyes hurt and her head pound. She'd left the children with Rose and Stephen, hadn't noted the time, so now she had no idea how long she'd been gone. Maggie couldn't seem to focus for more than a few seconds at a time. Her mind was distorting her thoughts and replaying the scenes from the afternoon, constantly interrupting any clear or rational thinking. The phone jumped impatiently in her hand as it continued to ring and ring and ring. Eventually, it fell silent as it went to voicemail. Maggie waited until a notification beeped. Then it rang again. She dropped her hand to her side, dropped the phone to the grass verge, and kept on walking. Rose would be all right. She always was. Rose had been the one to save the day. Maggie had been in a state of hysteria arriving at the hospital. The A&E staff had been so kind, gentle with both her and the children, reassuring them at every stage. It had shown Maggie that she had not at any point explained to the children what was happening. She had been so on autopilot, calling 999, getting them under a cooling shower to stop their skin cooking, to stop the burn seeping into their flesh, that she hadn't thought of how scared they must have been. It was yet another failure, stacking up on all the others. Leaving Emily and Elliot in the clearly more capable hands of the doctors, Maggie had trembled as she brought her phone to her ear, not really knowing how she would begin to explain this to Stephen. He would be angry. Over the years, his affectionate understanding of her flaws had turned into thinly veiled annoyance. She was making his life harder. She was supposed to make it easier. He had his job, the kids were hers, and clearly he felt that she wasn't up to scratch. No matter what she tried, somehow since the children they'd been out of sync. She often felt a million miles away from him, despite being in the same room. His phone rang and rang, then cut off. Pulled up short, Maggie brought the phone down to look at the screen. He had rejected her call. Angry at his persistent keeping of family at arm's length when it came to work, she dialed his number again and stood tense while the tone rang. A shorter time now before it was cut off once more. "Are you kidding me?" Maggie shouted, and the sound echoed down the empty corridor. Dialing a third time, Maggie closed her eyes. She knew it wouldn't help her cause if he could not be got hold of. Defective mother, absent father. She was in the middle of working out what she was going to say to the safeguarding people who were on their way, when suddenly Stephen's voice was in her ear, urgent and whispered. "What is it?" "Maggie, I'm in the middle of an important meeting. Can't this wait?" he asked through clenched teeth, talking to her but clearly performing for the benefit of the others in the room with him. "We're in A&E. The children... There was an accident. A pan of boiling water got dropped." Maggie noted that she had moved into the passive, not placing the blame where she felt it sat, with her. "What?" he asked, suddenly switching focus, work forgotten, as panic rose in his voice. "What happened? Are they okay?" he asked, and she heard the sounds of him rising from his chair and leaving the room for the confidentiality of the corridor. Maggie waited until he was where he could talk. "I don't know yet. They've been burnt. They were splashed with the boiling water, but I don't know how badly. I got them into the shower and called the ambulance. The doctor is looking over them now. I have to get back to them." Maggie's eyes brimmed with unspilt tears as she glanced back towards where they were. She was grateful that he was at the end of the phone. He would understand how she was feeling. He was silent for a long time as he processed the information. "So, the doctor is with them now. They're being looked after. They're okay." He was working something out in his head, but Maggie couldn't decipher what. She heard a door opening, the noise of his office flooding into the background. Maggie opened her mouth to speak, but paused. "I just have to finish this meeting first." He sounded strained. "It won't be long. Then I'll be right there. I can get the... Yes, I can make the 2:45 train. I'll miss the earlier one even if I leave now. I'll finish up here, then head straight to you. I'll be there as soon as I can." "Pardon?" Yes, I'm done now," he said to whoever in the room held his attention, to whoever was more important to him than his family. "I've got to go. I'll be there as soon as I can," he said, his attention already turned back to the meeting. It was clear in his voice. Maggie could tell she was alone. Not wanting to ask for fear of his answer and the sinking disappointment she knew she was about to feel in the very core of her, she stalled. "The social worker is coming to talk with me, you know. Routine. Do you think you'll manage to be here for that?" She was guarded, her anger at him rising. "I'll do my best, okay? Give them a kiss from me. I'll be there as soon as I can. I'll leave as soon as I can." And with that, the line went dead. He had hung up. Immediately she noticed that, although he had been scared for the children, he had not once asked her how she was. The kids mattered to him. She did not. Not anymore. Maggie stood, shaking in the whitewashed corridor. She needed someone who loved the children as she did, who could support her as she was falling apart. She had thought that Stephen would be that person. Obviously not. After a fleeting moment to acknowledge the trouble that her marriage appeared to be in, Maggie had lifted the phone and dialed again. Rose. Maggie felt guilty as she walked away from the ringing phone on the verge, but also felt her shoulders relax as the insistent beeping of the ringtone faded into the distance. Distance was what she needed. Distance was what everyone needed. She was toxic, and the only way that she could improve the mess she had made was to walk away, to remove herself from the equation. Maggie shuddered at her own euphemism. Rose would be furious. Rose, her beloved younger sister, who had immediately dropped everything the moment Maggie had told her where she and the children were. She had not hesitated to see if it was more important than what she was doing, because they were always the most important thing to her. Maggie had only had to hold herself together until Rose had arrived, walking into the department as fast as she could in her heels, tucking her phone away into her camel-coloured coat as she did so. Rose was the polar opposite to her tall, dark-haired sister. Petite, with an hourglass figure and blonde hair that fell down her back in waves. She had intense green eyes and a quality that made people turn back to look at her as they walked past. She was clearly someone. It was only because Rose had been there that Maggie had managed to keep it together once they got to the children's bedsides. The doctors were still tending to Emily and Elliot when Maggie and Rose had walked back in. Standing by their beds, talking to a medical student, was a lady who had not been there before. On one hand, she looked like the other nurses in the department, but there was something different about her. Her body language was distinct, less open. She caught Maggie's eye and smiled, tucking a strand of her straight brown hair behind her ear as she did so. She looked nervous, like she hadn't been doing this job too long and still wasn't sure how best to get started. Maggie's stomach felt like it had dropped through the floor, as though she were on a fairground ride that she desperately wanted to get off. "Mummy's back. Auntie Rose, too," Maggie called over to the children, not feeling that she could make her way to them, not feeling they were hers. They were being treated, and she needed to give the doctor space. "How are they?" Maggie asked, not entirely sure who she was directing the question to. She just needed to know that they were okay. "You must be Mummy." The woman glanced down at her notes. "Maggie," she said, looking up at her again. "The doctors are liaising with the burns unit at the moment. It's borderline, and they want to be sure," she said, matter-of-factly. Maggie couldn't hold the words in her mind long enough to decode them. Borderline? What did she mean by that? Just how bad was it? What had she done? "Maggie?" the lady repeated at her, bending her head slightly to try to catch her eye. The lady looked at her in a way Maggie felt was half pity, half suspicion. "I'm Rose, the children's aunt," Rose said, moving herself forward and offering her hand. "And you are?" she smiled. Rose had all of the charm. People generally fell at her feet, and she had to do very little other than be herself. It was wonderful to watch. People melted in front of her as though they were butter and Rose a warmed knife. She rarely had to be sharp. No one needed her to be. "I'm Ms. Watson," the lady replied, looking a little shy. She coughed, embarrassed, as Rose continued to smile at her. "Ms. Watson, Penelope. People call me Penny." She faltered and started checking her notes again as a blush rose up from her chest, peppering her collarbone with a pinkish rash. This continued slowly up her face until she was practically glowing before she looked up again. "Penny!" Rose repeated. "How lovely!" She smiled at her. Penny looked as though she couldn't quite work out if Rose was being kind or gently teasing her, which was also a fairly common reaction to Rose, Maggie noted. She had this effortlessness that could be misconstrued as false, but it was from a lifetime of getting her own way. Things were effortless if you were Rose. You got what you wanted. Chairs appeared for them, a gesture clearly for Rose. She glanced at the medical student who had brought them and threw him enough sunshine to get him through the rest of his shift with a smile on his face. Once he had gone, though, she stood next to Elliot's bed and started chatting to the children. She nodded at Maggie, indicating that she and Penny could start their own conversation now that the children were distracted. Penny shifted in her seat, cleared her throat, and began. Maggie sat holding her hands in each other to stop them shaking and tried to look Penny in the eye. It wasn't fair, Maggie thought, how the body language of fear was so close to that of guilt. She had spent the children's entire lives petrified that someone was going to catch her out, to tell her that she was a bad mother, that she shouldn't be a parent at all. After all, it's not like she planned them, was it? She didn't choose to become a mother, other than deciding not to have the abortions she had actively considered. How many times in their short lives had she questioned whether she'd made the right choice? The resentment at her own needs being pushed to the back of the queue overwhelmed her at times. Good mothers didn't feel like that, did they? Maggie was terrified that she wasn't worthy, and now, finally, someone was here to tell her that. "So, Maggie," Penny finally said, looking up to smile at her. It made Maggie feel as though she were on trial all the same. "As I believe the doctor told you earlier, I'm from the Safeguarding Liaison team. We just like to check in with families who may be having a difficult time of things to see if we can offer any support. So," she paused again to look at her notes, "tell me what happened. How did we all get here?" Maggie said nothing. Penny looked at her expectantly and then gestured her arm at her in a "you next" manner. Maggie stared at her, worrying that Penny would think her stupid for staying silent, but what could she say? "Maggie?" Penny tried again. Maggie cleared her throat and looked up at the ceiling, aware she was behaving oddly, yet unable to stop herself. She turned to Penny and said, blankly, "I was cooking dinner. Pasta. There was a toy on the floor of the kitchen I hadn't seen. I turned to the sink to drain the pasta water, and I trod on it. I slipped, I lost my hold on the pan, and I dropped it. The children were in the kitchen with me, playing. The pan bounced, and the water jumped out and splashed them. I took them upstairs to put the cool shower on them and called 999. She stopped. If she just stuck to the facts, then any further questions would give her a steer on what they were trying to get her to say. Penny looked at her again. "Maggie, how are you? Would you say you get overwhelmed a lot?" She paused briefly, then continued. "How are you sleeping? Do you have a support network you can call on?" Flashbacks from when Elliot was born and the postnatal depression questionnaire crashed into Maggie's mind. She had known what the answers needed to be in order to pass, and she hadn't wanted to admit to her failings. To admit them to others would be to admit them to herself. Believing in the professional experience of the health visitor to know of maternal subterfuge, Maggie had answered correctly. "Okay, Mummy, then that's great. I can officially discharge you," the health visitor had said and ticked the box. Maggie hadn't known whether to feel relieved or crushed. She had mostly just felt broken. This time, beyond fearful of what consequence a wrong answer might result in, Maggie took a deep breath and smiled straight at Penny. "I'm sleeping okay, as much as you can with two such young ones. I have my sister, as you can see, and my husband is on his way here now. He won't be long," she said, editing out the lack of practical or emotional support she had from him. "It had been a long day, and the children wanted to be near me while I prepared dinner. It was an accident." Penny met her gaze, trying to work out whether this was a one-off, an accident pure and simple, or the result of failings elsewhere. "Maggie, I know it's hard work being a mother." She looked down to check her notes once again. "I see that they're 2 and 1 years old, close together. That must be nice for them, if hard on you. Look, I know that the days are long," Penny said, not completing the cliché she fell back on. Parenting brings plenty of challenges, as I'm sure you know. So, how can we make sure this situation doesn't get repeated? Maggie couldn't look Penny in the face. She dug her nails into her hand to stop her from losing her tenuous grip on her composure. Sullenly, quietly, Maggie replied, "I will make sure from now on that they are not in the kitchen when I drain hot water." Maggie then sat in silence. What could she say? Penny was right. It had been her fault. "Okay," Penny said suddenly, closing her notebook and tucking it under her arm as she rose. "I'll chat things through with the team. We will follow up with you in a few days. Make sure everything is well." She held her hand out to shake Maggie's, which she reciprocated in shock. "Nice to meet you, Maggie. You too, Rose." And with that, she turned and left. Rose got up off the bed and came over to Maggie. Maggie felt like a piece of laundry, wrung out and draped on the line. "See?" Rose said, quietly and reassuringly. "It was an accident." Maggie let Rose hold her up whilst she felt she was splintering apart. What was she supposed to do now? Mothers are supposed to know, but she never did. She'd read all the books she was supposed to, and yet this instinct that she was supposed to have just wasn't there. In her life before, as a costume designer, she would look at material, at buttons, zips, fastenings, and just know what needed to go where and how it would look when it was done. What sort of person can create a dress but have no idea about another human? Maggie had never stopped to consider that her design instinct was moulded by years of training and experience that, as a mother, she just didn't have yet. She only saw the flaws, as though she were a dress with poorly stitched seams and uneven hems, waiting to come apart with a single pull on a loose thread. "Maggie!" She snapped round at the voice to see Stephen, pink in the cheeks and slightly out of breath. "There were no cabs, so I ran. I knew it'd be faster. How are they?" he breathed as a sheen of sweat formed on his face. It was cold outside, but overly warm on the ward, and he looked almost soggy as he stood there in his work suit and wool coat, literally suited for somewhere else. "God, Stephen!" Rose admonished. "You and your bloody running." Rose stepped forward to explain the latest, it being clear that Maggie was in no fit state. The two of them walked together to the children, who were excited at their father's arrival. Maggie was pale, trembling, and mute. Now Stephen had arrived, she could switch off, shut down. The children were no longer her sole responsibility. Looking at the tableau before her, two children, Stephen and Rose, moved Maggie into action. Slowly, without wanting to bring attention to herself, she picked up her bag and walked out of the door. She did not look back. She could not look back. The door closed behind her with barely a sound. Chapter 2. Maggie wandered, directionless, down residential streets darkened by the late November sky. Winter was starting to take hold before the defensive, festive lights pushed back the encroaching darkness. Several houses had curtains open, the lives being lived within them shown off like shadow puppet theatres. Family dinners being eaten, school children finishing homework, happy couples enjoying time together. Each one a slap in the face. She didn't deserve a family. Her family didn't deserve her. She stumbled onwards, not looking where she was going. She could barely see straight. Her mind was running through all the reasons that she had to keep walking, keep going, keep putting distance between her and her children. She had to keep them safe. Even before the horror of the dropped pasta, the hospital, and the safeguarding lecture, she could list error after error. She had not remained calm. She had shouted. She had made them cry with harsh words. Maggie felt ashamed. Day after day she was coming up short and letting them down. They were saddled with a tired, sad, impatient mother who failed to sit and enjoy them without half an eye on something else. Enjoy every moment, she was so often told, usually just at a moment that even a saint would struggle to enjoy. It goes so fast, was another regular comment. This made her panic. That in the day-to-day stumbling through motherhood, desperately trying to get it right, she was missing it. Missing the joy, the love, the wonder that the same people told her she must be experiencing. Was she? Maggie asked herself. Maggie thought of all the times she had yearned for her life before. Had she ever really felt the same love for her new life that she clearly felt for her old? The question hit Maggie in the guts. She felt guilty for even asking it, but guiltier still when she couldn't bring herself to answer. Certainly she wasn't happy with her life right at the moment, but was she unhappy? Everything had happened so quickly. Marriage, then Emily, then Elliot, all within 2 years, that she hadn't had time to think about anything else. She had just been reacting to circumstance. Maggie felt a wave of despair wash over her, cold and cruel. What the hell was she playing at? What the hell did she think she was doing? Her injured children were still in hospital. Stephen and Rose would be worried at her disappearance, and here she was, wandering the streets. She should go back to her family. Except family to Maggie was where she felt like she was failing every single day. Tears welled in her eyes at the thought of the mess she had created. She loved her children with every shred of her soul, but she also knew that she was a terrible mother. She couldn't even get the basics right. Neither of them slept well, they were often tired, neither was a great eater. Emily was at the stage where every single thing became a battle. She might have blinded Emily, might have disfigured them both for life. She was a worthless mother, defective. Her own mother obviously wondered why Maggie was finding it so hard when she had managed perfectly well in her day. Little comments lanced at her. Well, you know what I'd say, but... And then a long pause, followed by a defeatist sigh. But you have your own ways, and apparently that works for you. Maggie remembered when she had been floored by a sickness bug, Stephen was away, and she had begged Rose to help her as Maggie could barely leave the bathroom. Rose had taken both children out for a while so that Maggie could rest. "You should have seen us, Maggie. The kids were perfectly behaved for me, and everyone we met commented on what a perfect family we were," Rose had said when they got back. Maggie recalled feeling both proud of her sister, relieved that it had gone well, but also annoyed at her for rubbing in how easy it was. Rose often had limited patience with people in general, and yet she seemed to have endless patience and understanding for terrible two behaviour, and could stay calm while the children raged. Hot tears cascaded down Maggie's face as she realised that her sister, a difficult person to handle, an easy person to love, would be a better mother for her children. Rose was the one with them now, after all, whereas she was a tear-stained mess, stumbling through throngs of people on the street. "I'm a disaster," she whispered to herself. "I should just do everyone a favour and disappear." She wiped her face on the sleeve of her jumper and desperately tried to think clearly. Disappear. If she were to go, then Rose would have to step in to look after Emily and Elliot. They were the only people Maggie had never seen Rose be selfish with. For the children, she was always her best self, maybe because they were what she wanted. She'd always wanted a family. Stephen, well, he'd cope. Maggie wasn't sure that he cared anymore anyway, not since the birth of Elliot. He always had his mind on his job, the idea of being the breadwinner so important to him. "We could send Emily and Elliot to a nursery, just a few hours a week. I could do a little freelance work, bring some money in. It'd take the pressure off us both, or a nanny. They could stay home with a nanny," she had begged. "No, it's okay. I am fine. We're fine. They're still little. They need their mother. They don't need a stranger. It'd confuse them. They need not to feel abandoned." He hadn't seen her desperation. Desperation for some space to breathe. He hadn't seen her drowning. He loved the children fiercely. They were what mattered to him. He'd be fine. Her babies. Her dear babies. She wanted the best for them, and she knew now that the best wasn't her. It would be horrible. Hard, of course it would, but they would be safe. She could do this. She had to do this. She had to keep them safe. Penny had said it. It was the single most important thing she could do for them. But how many nights would they cry for her? How many days would they go to the door expecting it to be her and be disappointed? Maggie stopped suddenly, nearly causing the man behind to crash into her. He muttered as he swerved past, "Idiot." She tried to calm her breathing, trying to calm her mind. She hadn't said goodbye. She couldn't not say goodbye. She hadn't prepared herself for this. This wasn't right, just leaving them at the hospital. But it was her fault they were there in the first place, wasn't it? Maybe they hated her. Maybe they would even be scared of her. Maybe they would cling to Stephen, to Rose, the ones they knew loved them but had never hurt them. She felt sick. The idea that her children no longer trusted her to keep them safe. She no longer trusted herself. She had to go. Images of Emily and Elliot, all smiles and giggles, came to her. The thought of never seeing them again made her stomach contract and bile rise up in her throat. Could she walk away from them? From their faces, nuzzled against hers, breathing in their sweet breath as they fell into sleep, their limp, trusting bodies relaxing against her as they drifted off. Could she walk away and pray against all hope that one day they would understand that she did this for them? Would they ever forgive her? She loved them so much, but she was failing them. She couldn't love them really, because she was drowning just trying to care for them. They deserved better than she could give them. Maybe she was justifying it to herself. Maybe it was the truth. For the first time in what felt like years, Maggie had a plan, and she could see it clearly in her mind's eye. She would disappear. Suddenly, as if the universe had been bringing her to this understanding, she turned the corner to find that she had walked to the coach station. Its noise and lights were a shock to her, and she recoiled. She needed calm, quiet, dark. Nothing. It was late now. Stephen and Rose would be worried, and the children would be needing to go to sleep. Were they home, or in hospital still? Maggie hoped that Rose would remember how to get them to sleep wherever they were. She hoped that Emily's hair would be stroked as she snuggled down in bed, that someone would have brought Elliot his favourite blanket to hold, that Rose would mother them. Maggie couldn't anymore. She had done them so much harm. She had to cut them from her mind, if such a thing was even possible. She knew that she couldn't think clearly here, so close to home. She needed their apron strings to stretch so far that they had to break. Only then could she decide how to end things. How not to get it wrong again. No, this is wrong. I have to go back to them. They need me, they need their mother. Maggie shook her shoulders to try to shake off some of the heaviness that she felt, and put her hand into her pocket to get her phone to check tickets and timetables. Her mind working hard to focus on the necessary logistics, shutting everything else out. Her fingers closed around space. Her phone. At first she panicked, but then recalled dropping it and walking away. A feeling of weightlessness briefly washed over her. She was disconnected. This was the right thing to do. Maggie made her way to the information kiosk, hoping that it was still even possible to buy a ticket in person. "How can I help?" the lady asked, still chirpy at what looked like the end of a long day, if the number of empty mugs littered around her was any indicator. They reminded Maggie of the half-drunk cups of tea, cooling, as she desperately tried to get Elliot to feed properly, or to calm Emily as another tiredness tantrum tore through her. "Yes, love. Can I help you?" the lady asked again, gesturing at a queue forming behind Maggie as she stood, mute and motionless. "Oh, sorry. I'd like a ticket to Glasgow, I guess. Please," Maggie found herself saying, shocked at the words coming out of her mouth. She opened her purse and found that she had money. "Cambridge to Glasgow. You'll need to change at Birmingham." She paid the lady, took her ticket, and walked to her stop. Standing by the coach, a visceral wave of pain shot through her, squeezing at her chest as if a band had tightened around it. Maggie struggled to stay upright. She swallowed it down and forced her resisting legs to take the 3 small steps up into the coach. The door shut behind her, the driver wanting to keep the warm air inside, stale though it was, rather than let in the evening chill. Maggie sat down and pressed her nails into the back of her hand in order to stop herself from getting off. She needed to cancel out her brain until it was done. It wasn't working. She could feel herself wanting to tear her body off the seat, warm and overly patterned, so as not to show how grubby it was, and run back home to her children. But something was holding her firm, refusing to let her get up. This was for them. They would be better, more rested, happier, safe. Better with a different mother. Happier with someone else. She was bad for them. She was bad for their development, for their happiness. She was bad. Maggie pushed harder into her hand, the pain stopping the tears coming as her blood started to leak out of the tiny cut she was making in her skin. She held her breath, her body shaking as the doors opened and shut one more time, and the driver started the engine. The coach moved back and out of the depot, and she was away. She was gone. Chapter 3. Rose stepped through the door into the darkened house, followed by Stephen, carrying both children half asleep over his shoulder. It was late and the house was silent and cold. "She's not here," Rose said, looking worriedly at her brother-in-law. He shook his head, his expression a mixture of concern and annoyance, and something else Rose couldn't put her finger on. "I'll take these 2 up to bed, and then we can sort things out," he replied, as he gingerly headed to the stairs, trying not to jolt Emily and Elliot, who clung to him. Rose stepped forward and kissed them on the top of their heads, breathing in the scent of childhood, warm and scented like crayons and soap, with an additional unwelcome medicinal tang. "Night-night, my darlings." Rose watched as the 3 of them disappeared into the upstairs darkness, their outline silhouetted from light that streamed in from the street through the landing window. It should have been a sweet scene, 2 sleepy kids being tucked into bed by their loving father. Rose swallowed hard. The children were going to be okay. The hospital had assured them that Maggie had done all the right things, the burns would most likely heal without scarring, and the local nurse would check up with them to arrange changing dressings and to see that all was healing well. "Paracetamol," Rose said out loud to the empty hallway, reminding herself that the nurse had suggested they have some ready for when the hospital painkillers wore off in the night. She walked into the kitchen to where the medicines were kept in a high-up cupboard and turned on the light. Jesus! The scene in front of her caused Rose to take a sharp intake of breath. It was carnage. There was a burnt smell which Rose managed to track down to the pan of what might once have been pasta sauce, but was now charred and stuck fast to the bottom of the pan. The floor was covered with sticky pasta water and cooked pasta, apart from 2 distinct areas where there was none, and the starchy residue had been wiped at. Rose felt sick. It was like looking at those chalk outlines of a body, only the marks were where her niece and nephew had been, the boiling water sticking to their delicate skin rather than to the floor. "No, Daddy, it hurts! Don't go, no!" Rose turned back to look at the hallway, hearing the cries of Emily and Elliot. "Okay, it's okay." "Daddy!" Emily wept from upstairs. Should she go up? Did Stephen need help? Where on earth was Maggie? Unsure of what best to do, Rose started picking up the mess around her. The chaos wasn't just from the accident either. There was laundry in piles everywhere, some dirty, some clean. The washing up was half done. There were toys all over the place. If tidy house, tidy mind was a thing, Maggie was clearly in a bad place. "She'll be home soon. She can't have gone far," Rose thought as she picked up the pasta, wiped down the surfaces, and tried to clean away any trace of the awful scene that the room held within it. The children didn't need to see this, neither did Stephen. They had enough to deal with. Rose felt a sense of satisfaction as she brought the room back into order. She looked up at the clock above the kitchen door. It had been a housewarming gift from Stephen's father, Edward, and Rose recalled the moment Maggie had unwrapped it, the memory sharp in her mind. Stephen's father had laughed when Maggie pulled back the stiff, smart wrapping paper and beautiful ribbons. "Now you have no excuse for being late all the time." He had looked around the room, expecting humorous agreement with him on this perceived flaw of his daughter-in-law's. Maggie had tried hard to smile politely. Rose had winced. Stephen's father never seemed to have a kind word for her sister. Nothing she did was ever good enough, and that was before she'd had the children. She was late now, though, Rose thought. She should have called back. She should have come back to the hospital. She should be here. "Where are you?" Rose said out loud. Had something happened to her, or was she roaming the darkened streets in distress? Rose shivered and wrapped her arms around herself. Rose had known for a while that all was not well with her sister's marriage, but today it had been loud and clear for anyone who knew them. Thinking back at the hospital, did they even speak to each other? Both she and Stephen had been so focused on the children that neither saw Maggie leave. Not sure what to do with herself, but not feeling that she could sit down either, Rose wandered from room to room. She'd been here a million times, but had she ever really looked? What had she missed all those other times? What signs had she been oblivious to? She stopped by a photo on the living room mantelpiece. All of them sat together on the floor of the photographer's studio. A family, a group, a unit. Looking more closely, Rose saw a tautness to Stephen's jaw and a redness to Maggie's eyes. Not all happy families then on this day either, it seemed. Elliot looked like Maggie, but Emily was the spitting image of her Aunt Rose, with the same green eyes and blonde wavy hair she'd had as a child. Rose picked the picture up, wiped a thin layer of dust from the glass, and gazed longingly at it, as she wondered if her own children would look the same. She wanted this. She wanted a family of her own. She was the adored baby of the family, and she was used to getting her own way. Charming, even as a child, she had a way of knowing how best to present a question so as to get the answer she wanted. She understood what made people tick and how that was useful to her. She expected everything, and she usually got it. In all things, but this. It hadn't passed Rose as unironic that her sister, without effort, had ended up with a husband and 2 children. A family that she knew that Maggie was never 100% sure that she had wanted. Whereas she absolutely did want a family, but was single and had not met anyone lately that suggested this would be changing any time soon. Rose wouldn't admit it, to herself or anyone else, but she was envious of her sister. The children were beautiful and funny and obviously adored their mother. Maggie had everything, and Rose felt that she had nothing that mattered. She could see how it would suit her so much better than Maggie. Sometimes life just wasn't fair. "Rose." Stephen's voice, tight with stress, called from upstairs, breaking Rose's train of thought. "Yes?" "Can you come up here? I need you." Rose ran upstairs to the children's bedroom with a hint of pleasure at being needed. The door was open, throwing light into the dimly lit room where Stephen was struggling to get pyjamas onto the children. Drawers were left open and messy, where he had rifled through them to find what he was looking for. He looked up at her, ruffled and exhausted. Something inside her jolted, but she pushed it away. "Not enough hands. I can't get them over their heads gently enough and hold it away from the sore patches." He looked pained, desperate. Elliot sniffled. "Ow!" "I know, lovely," Rose said, nodding sympathetically. "What we need here is a team effort," she said, taking things under control. Her bright smile spread to the others in the room, and there was a shift in the atmosphere. Rose was here, so everything would be okay. "Arms up, lovely," Rose said gently as she and Stephen eased first Emily, then Elliot into their PJs. "This would have been easier with Maggie here, someone who knows what they're doing," Rose thought, silently admonishing her sister for wandering off. Rose tried not to nudge the sore skin on Emily's face. It had been so close to being so much worse, the burn right next to her eye. Rose shivered as she thought of the what-ifs and knew Maggie must be feeling the same. Rose checked her watch again. What was keeping Maggie? She'd been gone for hours now. It was cold and dark out there. A tingle of misgiving ran down her spine. "Into bed now," Stephen said, giving Rose a grateful look. "Where's Mama?" asked Emily. "Mama does stories. Mama puts me to bed. I want Mama." Stephen looked panicked. He said nothing. He clearly didn't know what to say. "It's a daddy story time tonight. It's special. Mama is out at the moment. She'll be back as soon as she can," Rose said, knowing this to be vague enough to be true and reassuring. She dipped down to kiss them both on their heads. "You two snuggle down now and get comfy." "Ow! Ow!" Emily yelled as she snuggled into her usual sleeping position. She leapt up again. "Ow!" Elliot echoed. "Oh, darlings, I know. Oh, the paracetamol. I left it downstairs. Back in 2 ticks." Where have you got to? Rose thought as she went downstairs. She took her phone from her pocket. Dialing Maggie's number, Rose leant wearily on the doorframe. The phone rang and rang and rang, then went to voicemail. "Hi, it's Maggie. Leave a message and I'll get back to you," her sister's voice rang out. "Mags, it's me. Where are you? You can't just walk out of a hospital and leave your kids, for God's sake. What are you playing at? Call me back, or better still, come home." Rose snapped as she hung up. She immediately felt bad. She called again, but it went to voicemail once more. This was not a normal day, and Maggie was not in a normal place. She didn't need to be yelled at. Rose took deep breaths as she walked back upstairs with the medicine. Stephen was struggling to get them to settle. Elliot had turned into a limpet and would not let go. It was impossible to do anything but hold him. Emily was also very clingy and was tired and teary. "Where's Mama? I want Mama! Mama!" Rose sat on the floor between the two beds and stroked her niece's head. "She'll be back, Puppet, she'll be back." The reassurance was both for Emily and for herself. Rose gave both children some painkillers to help them to sleep. "Let's all hop into bed and we can snuggle down and read a story while we wait for her, shall we?" she whispered into the darkened room. She laid Emily into her bed and arranged Elliot next to her, careful not to nudge any of the dressings. The siblings wriggled close to each other, comforted by the other's presence and the familiarity of their room. Stephen stepped back, clearly happy to have someone else in charge here. He may have been wonderful at his job, but he was clearly clueless when it came to the kids. This was not his domain. Here, Rose happily commanded the room, and he backed away, leaving her to it. She picked a book that she knew they both loved and started to read. Midway through the story, Rose paused as she noticed a change in the children.